So, this is a video that I've been trying to make for a long time now, and I've been through a couple of different formats and a couple of different scripts, and ultimately I've scratched it every time just because I haven't been pleased with how it was coming across. But I'm going to go entirely off the script here and just see if I can make it work this time around. So I apologize in advance if this gets a little bit ranty or if this gets a little bit off the rails, but I do really want to get this out there. Before I get going too far, I want to say that yes, this title is dramatic. Squad is technically selling more copies than it's ever sold, there's a ton of active players right now, and it really doesn't show any signs of slowing down. This is more of a personal experience from me, based on what I get out of Squad and how that's changed over the years. Now, there are two extremely big problems that I have with Squad. There are a few other smaller ones, but I feel like the developers are addressing them all in a reasonable fashion. But there are two that are massive and seem to be, if not ignored, at least not prioritized when I feel that they really should be. The first issue here is the community. Squad is 100% entirely based around its community. It's a teamwork and communication-oriented game. It's no secret that your success in Squad entirely depends on your teammates and your squad mates. It's an incredibly social game, and that really is the fundamental building block of what makes it great. There are a million shooters out there, both arcadey and realistic, and the one thing that they all lack is Squad's community. Now, the two biggest pros that Squad has going for it when it comes to developing this community is first off that it is the successor to Project Reality, and a lot of Project Reality's fanbase has moved over to Squad and has carried in the same principles that they had in that game, in which teamwork was even more important than it is in Squad. And then the second real positive that they have going for them is that the developers have created a game that requires teamwork to succeed in. All of the game design decisions and choices are made with teamwork in mind. Will this new feature promote teamwork? Yes, we'll add it, or no, let's tweak it until it does. And OWI have done great with this for a long time, and the community in Squad was pretty good for a long time. When I first left Project Reality to start playing Squad, which was back in V9, I definitely noticed a drop in the quality of the community and the teamwork and the communication, but it wasn't massive and it didn't have insane repercussions. And even back then, most of the problems with the community didn't come from a unwillingness to communicate or to cooperate. It just came from people massively misunderstanding the core concepts of the game, or the objectives, or what was important in achieving success. Of course, there still were some stereotypical Mikeless marksman type players. I'm not saying that they didn't exist, but they didn't get any enjoyment or fulfillment from the game. Every time they joined a squad, it was very likely that there would be a mic check and they would immediately be kicked. If they did somehow manage to get in and keep their kit, the moment they started wandering off from the rest of the squad, they were also likely to be kicked. And then even if they got to fulfill their fantasy and go Chris Kyle out in the woods, it might have been fun for a bit, but ultimately that would run dry pretty quickly and they would leave the game because they weren't playing it the way it was intended and they weren't seeing the benefits of playing it the way it was intended. They never got to experience that teamwork-based, larger-than-yourself strategy aspect of Squad, where everyone's just a cog in the machine and everyone understands their role and how it relates to everyone else. That same amazing feeling that you get when a team of 40 or soon-to-be 50 people are all working together to achieve the same goal. That'll keep you going in Squad for months. I have probably around 2,500 hours in Squad because I enjoy that sensation so much. And the Mikeless marksman is going to get, 5 headshots and get bored. Now, the biggest thing that has an effect on Squad's community is Squad's growth. There is no other game like Squad on the market, and when most people go and purchase Squad, unless they're coming from a strictly Arma 3 or Arma 2 background, there's a very, very, very high chance that they are going to misinterpret what the game is about. They are going to see this as a more hardcore Battlefield, or a larger scale insurgency sandstorm. What they don't realize is how much communication and cooperation comes into play in this game, and how every action is going to require more than one person, and how there's going to be an entire team behind the scenes working on things as basic as transportation and logistics just to ensure that people can actually get rifles to the front lines. The scale of Squad is lost on most new players. And under the old format, they would quickly learn the scale of squad. They would join an infantry squad. The squad leader would do a mic check. So right off the bat, if they weren't willing to communicate and didn't have a mic, they would quickly feel unwelcome and feel pressured into that role. And if they did have a microphone, they very quickly realized that there was a structure to this game, that they were being told what to do by the squad leader. This wasn't just Battlefield, where the squad leader is a mobile spawn point who happened to be in that position. This is somebody who chose to take on responsibility as a leader and to work with a group of 8 other people to accomplish goals. Very quickly you start to learn that this isn't the type of game that you're used to. And very quickly you learn that you need to be telling people that you're new, you need to be taking less important kits like Rifleman or Medic, and you need to work your way through this new, massive, complicated game that's honestly pretty awe-inspiring when you consider that it's all being done by 40 strangers. Now, when we have massive sales and massive growth to the game, new players come in with their Battlefield mindset, and they meet other people with Battlefield mindsets, and they join a squad with a player who created it because nobody else was willing to lead a squad because of all of the Battlefield mindset players. And so you end up with the blind leading the blind, and everybody who has experience in the game, so incredibly sick of trying to train everyone or trying to deal with people disobeying things constantly, and just trying to deal with this new massive influx of players who don't understand what squad is about, that all these veteran players tend to make smaller locked squads with their friends where they can actually accomplish things without having to essentially herd cats for 10 minutes to even get the most basic of functions complete. And so you end up with this cycle, like I said, the blind leading the blind, that just leads to really, really low tier squad gameplay. If you hop into a match in the current version, V18, and you compare it against a match in V9, it just looks like a parody of squad gameplay. Now, although this is a problem and we're all feeling the effects, it is not the biggest problem. Squad has had its ups and downs, the free weekends, sales, etc. It always bounces back. And that is because, and this is very important, Squad is a game that is won by teamwork. As I said before, every single game design decision is made with teamwork in mind. So unless you are using teamwork, you are always going to be subpar at the game. And because of that, as people play for longer and longer and have the urge to get better and better, as they always do, eventually they are going to learn that those are required aspects of the game. So even though the community is in a lull, it's always eventually going to go back towards peak squad gameplay, because that is the way you play squad effectively. Which leads us to the second really big problem, which is the way that OWI is handling the situation. And that is with casualization, for lack of a better term. If you look at the update V13, it was really the biggest, most in-your-face example of this. There had been a couple of subtle things in the past that were arguably for game design decisions rather than for pure casualization, but nobody can deny that V13 added nothing but crutches for the types of players that were flooding into squad. And when you end up with a situation like this, you have massive unintended repercussions. Rather than trying to take your new players and rise them to the level of your complicated and interesting game, you are taking your complicated and interesting game and dumbing it down to the level of new players. Now, the big counter-argument to be made here is that these three things aren't that big of a deal, and I'm sure that's what OWI was thinking, and I'm sure that's what a lot of people who don't mind the more casual direction that Squad is taking would say as an argument to this. There are two arguments I'll make to that. The first one being that, first off, it is to some extent a matter of principle. There's a certain pride that comes with playing a difficult game. You'll see a ton of this with the new rise in popularity with Tarkov. There are so many Tarkov players with tons of experience who are just sitting back and kind of enjoying watching really popular streamers who are really good at other games try to get into the very difficult realistic shooter that is Tarkov. Like I said, there's just a certain level of pride and accomplishment that comes from playing and eventually mastering a difficult game. When you start adding these kind of casualization updates, it starts to take away from that experience, and it starts to make people feel as if they're being cheated out of something they've rightfully earned. Even if these things had absolutely no tangible effect on gameplay, they have a massive effect on the perception of the community. The second, much bigger argument is that these things did have a massive effect on gameplay. Now, I'm not talking about Dead and the movement speed bonus. These two things I firmly believe fall under the first category, where people's perception of the game becoming more casual influenced them to see a lot of differences when in reality those didn't affect gameplay that much. Honestly, in my experiences trying to be as unbiased as I possibly can and trying to look at things as objectively as I possibly can, I never noticed a difference in the flow of the game with these two things added. However, the buddy rally was absolutely massive. And the worst part is, OWI didn't intend for that to be the case. In the patch notes, the buddy rally said nothing more than it was being introduced to add to the flexibility of the squad leader. In more recent times, with the controversy of buddy rally and the eventual removal, it was being quoted from developers all of the time as being a system to aid in the recovery of vehicles. Now, I don't think that either of these are true. I think that there was some new blood in OWI, or some new fresh perspective, or somebody who was commenting on how difficult it was to access for new players. Somebody who was looking at how many new players were turned away when they would get into a situation where, for example, their squad leader would get wiped off an objective and they would be stuck spawning at main, grabbing a vehicle, and driving all of the way back. All of that downtime that comes from not managing spawns well is boring for the people under the squad leader, and I believe that it was an attempt to make for more constant action, to keep more new players invested into the game and constantly at the front lines. Now, the consequences of this were absolutely massive. I have an entire video for that. I apologize, the audio in that video is pretty shitty. I didn't have a good microphone and I was having a lot of trouble with Sony Vegas. But if you are willing to sit through it, there's an entire video, which I'll link up to the top right there, talking about all of the unintended consequences of buddy rallies. Essentially, it took one of the most massive and fundamental aspects of the strategic element of the game, which is logistics, which is something that is unique to Squad, entirely teamwork focused, and has a steep learning curve, and then it completely got rid of that so that new players could get into the action 2 minutes earlier. It took a lot of the focus away from teamwork and coordination and put it straight into immediate gratification and just appealing to the casual player. Now, the buddy rally has been almost entirely removed from the game, and I was thrilled with that news because it brought back so much content that I haven't really been able to access in Squad for such a long amount of time. But the problem remains. The problem remains that OWI continues to put out these updates that pander towards the casual player. I'll probably put a list of them on screen now. As I said, I'm doing this unscripted, so I don't have them all ready like I did. But there are so many little things in Squad that encourage team play that have been removed. I remember back when you couldn't see the capture status of flags, meaning that if you were a defensive squad leader and you started losing the flag without telling your team in command chat, they would be pissed with you, because they would have no other way to tell. Once again, encouraging communication and teamwork. I remember a time when you would always want 2 medics per squad, because they were the only ones who could revive, and at any given point, anyone could take a 50 cal to the head and be immediately wiped. If you lost your medic and you only had 1 medic, you were in deep shit. Having 2 medics meant that there were more support roles, which meant there was more teamwork. It also meant that you had to keep your medics safe, which required more small unit tactics and more strategic thinking, with pretty dire consequences if you were unable to protect your medics and then were required to move back to your fob and move out again. I also remember when rally points were basically super spawns, where you had a limited number of spawns, which meant that you were required to communicate with your squad about how many they were able to take, and you had to communicate to make sure that they were saving one for the squad leader to replace the rally, and also that it simply didn't allow for immediate give-ups and respawns. Medics played a more in-depth role. Keeping your squad alive was more important. You didn't get immediate 30-second one-ticket trade-off respawns. Now, one of the worst offenders of this attempt to casualize having absolutely terrible, unforeseen consequences is the way that helicopters were implemented. And I mean this in several ways. First of all, the flight model. Now, I have an entire video on this, so once again I'll link it up top, and once again, sorry for the shitty audio, different time, different equipment. But the helicopter flight model is terrible. It was made in an attempt to be accessible, and in doing so, they decided not to go from a really strictly physics-based standpoint. And ultimately, there's no other nice way of saying it, they failed miserably. It is incredibly unintuitive. Anyone who has any experience flying in any game, whether it's a flight sim or literally Battlefield 2, has to completely unlearn everything they know to learn how to fly in the squad flight model. It doesn't behave like a helicopter in the slightest. And that might be fine if it behaved a lot easier than a helicopter does, but honestly, it's really tough. Landing the helicopter is kind of impossible when it's just very difficult to predict your deceleration, how quickly you can stop, and it's very, very difficult to make fine adjustments after hovering when you need to land somewhere that isn't exactly where you came to a halt to, without massively overshooting those LZs because of the rubber banding tendencies, where you dip your nose 5 degrees and suddenly you're slingshotting at 60 knots. The flight model is awful. Not just because it's pandering towards a more casual player base, but because it entirely failed in doing so, and in turn made it significantly harder than they wanted. Now, the other main issue with helicopters is the survivability. When they released, they were absolute tanks. There was a patch that made them slightly weaker, but they are still definitely tanks. This one definitely comes into more of a casualization role because honestly, I was looking forward to the release of helicopters because I was going to kind of have a laugh at the carnage. I know the way that people fly helicopters in Battlefield games, and it just doesn't work both in real life settings and in squad or Project Reality. If you look at Project Reality, you'll see what happens when a community adapts to very difficult helicopters. Helicopters in that game will die if an autocannon so much as sneezes in their direction, so in turn you get pilots flying very low to the ground, very fast, and always near a map border. They'll be weaving in and out of buildings. It's really cool to see the hotshot pilots in Project Reality. And I figured that this was also going to translate well to squad, and that everybody was going to fly it like they would in Battlefield at incredibly high altitudes, just loitering, doing circles over the whole area, and they were all going to get shot down and there was going to be a steep learning curve. I was so incredibly wrong. Those things can survive anything, so nobody has any fear. The only sketchy part is landing. You'll see helicopters performing recon missions. You'll see helicopters doing literally CAS runs because they can get away with it, because there is nothing punishing this incredibly casual and arcadey playstyle. Now, helicopters had the perfect opportunity to fit perfectly within Squad's mission statement, to be communication and teamwork-driven support assets, and instead they're being used as run 'em and gun 'em type things by new players who can get away with it. Now, there are also other unintended consequences to this. For example, there have been situations where I have been driving in an open-top logi from an objective to an objective, and an enemy helicopter has flown over me. Now, in the real world, that helicopter should be terrified of me. I consist of 9 people with automatic weapons in both intermediate and full-sized cartridges. That should be absolutely terrifying to a thin-skinned, unarmed helicopter. And yet the exact opposite is true. I have to have my guys hop out, I have to have all 9 of them aim for the gunner, and then I have to have the lat try his best to hit a moving target 300 meters in the sky using the ammo that we have on our truck. And then I have to pray that it works, because in most situations, that unarmored tin can of a helicopter is going to take 0 hull damage from any of our weapons, probably dodge every single rocket we fire at it, and then absolutely mow us into the ground, destroying our truck, most likely killing most of the infantry and leaving us stranded in the middle of nowhere. Now, as I said, this is the perfect example of OWI trying to appeal to the new player by making something much more casual than it has any right to be, and instead failing miserably and having massive unintended consequences that fuck up other aspects of the rest of the game. And so, here we stand in the current version, and admittedly, yes, OWI has resolved some of the issues in the past. For example, they revoked a few of the V13 changes. They added back something somewhat resembling Dead on a much more tame and easy to digest fashion that doesn't really have the same consequences. And eventually they removed Buddy Rally after 8 months of pretty much every veteran player complaining about it on the subreddit and on the forums. And this is months after trying to justify the poll that basically went 50-50 on whether or not they should keep it in the game. And bear in mind, that's a massive number when you consider that every single new player who really only sees this as a means to get into the action faster is going to vote yes to that. And literally, the default vote for anyone who isn't particularly opinionated is yes, sure, fine, new update. Keeping in mind that that accounts for the majority of the 50% who are for it, and then so much of the remaining community voted against it, and they still kept it in for that long. It just reeks of office politics. It feels like Buddy Rally is somebody's pet project, and they barely got that 51% number they needed to justify keeping it in, despite the obvious controversy and the obvious negative impact it was having to anyone who understood the game. But the issue really lies with all of the small things that have slipped under everyone's radar that makes infantry combat so much less rewarding in the current version than it used to be. Going back and watching old footage recently, it really made me realize just how brain dead the current meta is. With spawns as readily available and as fast as they are, it really is just old Soviet throw bodies at the enemy until they fall down tactics, unless you're smart enough to understand how to deal with spawns themselves. In which case, it becomes a game of Logitrucks versus combat engineers. And even if you don't believe that all of those small updates have added up to something significant like I do, you can't deny that there is a real danger of whatever the next update is. Anytime I see patch notes, I have to hold my breath because I don't know if we're going to get another Buddy Rally situation or if we're going to get another CAS transport helicopter situation. I just don't know what the next Buddy Rally is going to be. I do have a theory. I mean, if you look at the SDK right now, you can see CAS variants of the transport helicopters. Basically just Blackhawks or Mi-8s with rocket pods, dumbfire rockets strapped onto the sides. I'll try to find some pictures if I can. Anyway, if you look at this and you were listening to what I just said about all the transport helicopters, you understand my apprehension. If nothing changes and these things get released into the game with, say, a high ticket cost and delay spawn to justify them, they are going to absolutely demolish everything. Anytime you have a situation where it's purely infantry and there's no HMGs or armor around, they are just going to have free reign over that infantry. They don't need to fear 7.62, they don't need to fear small arms. They'll just hammer the absolute fuck out of any squad stupid enough to show themselves to them. And then even if you do have armor, a scout car, anything like 14.5, that's just going to be a deterrent. That's going to be something that probably hits the helicopter a few times so the helicopter leaves and decides it's not worth it. Autocannons, maybe you'll get a kill on them if you're lucky, but for the most part, it's just going to be a means to wave the helicopter off. Just like the current version, the main counter to this is going to be tanks, and honestly, there just aren't enough tanks in squad to go around to protect, to be the main counter against a goddamn unarmored, thin-skinned helicopter. That thing should literally fear anyone with a rifle that chambered in 5.56 or 5.45. Anyway, all of my other scripts were a lot more constructive, talking about what we could do in terms of tutorials to help the community, or how we could work with OWI to resolve these problems, and honestly this one did turn into just more of a rant. I told myself I'd upload it, so I'm going to upload it anyway, without the positive, uplifting end section about what can be done to prevent this. But I just wanted to bring more awareness to this problem, because I feel like there's a lot of people in the lower end of squad who are just getting into it who don't understand how much it's affecting everything. And I feel like there are a lot of people in the upper end who feel the way I do but don't know how to put it into words or don't have a voice to express it. So I want to put this video out there in the hopes that it gains some popularity, it gains some traction. Hopefully somebody at OWI sees it and shares it. And ultimately, if you feel the way I do, don't hesitate to spread this. Don't hesitate to be a part of this message, essentially. And with that somewhat awkward outro, I guess I will catch you guys in the next one.